Thank you very much for having me.
Before we go into student Q&A, we have some questions to ask you. So firstly, please could you talk to us about your career journey and how it has led you to your current role?
It's been a weird one. I don't think I've met anyone else who's had quite the same path into doing what I do for a living. I started off as a writer, writing guidebooks, travel guidebooks to Southeast Asia and to Indonesia. And during the time that I was doing that work, I led my first big expedition, which was try and walk solo across New Guinea. That was in 1997, a stratospheric failure, about as dismal and catastrophic a complete disaster as it's possible to have, but a fantastic learning experience, one that really set me on the road to setting up my expedition skills, getting my logistics sorted, and learning how to do it properly. At the end of that, I decided to make a film myself. So I took myself to the jungles of Colombia and spent about 6 weeks in the jungle on my own, catching snakes and spiders and scorpions, made it into a film and took it to the National Geographic. They not only bought the film, but took me on as their adventurer in residence, the grandest job title I have ever had. And I spent about 5 years with National Geographic doing that job, which was sensational, leading expeditions all over the world, running a long-running conservation series as well, which is when I made my first programs about climate change back in about the year 2000. When that came to a close, I moved to the BBC in 2003 onto their long-running kids wildlife series, The Really Wild Show. Then came up with the idea for Deadly 60 and the expeditions, the Lost Land expeditions, and I've been doing it ever since. So I've been over 20 years now, 23 years working in wildlife and expedition television, and it's given me some very, very happy times, lots and lots of extraordinary and extreme experiences, and fingers crossed we are not done yet.
And Steve, please can you describe some of your experiences of working in television?
Well, so the kind of television that I make is kind of different to a lot of wildlife television. The stuff that you see Sir David Attenborough making, every single frame is a work of art. Every single sequence with an animal may have taken 4 years to film and could require people sitting in a hide or sitting up a tree for months on end. My stuff is a bit more rough and ready than that. So I work with small teams. Sometimes it's just myself and the cameraman. Sometimes it's even just myself. And it's much more rough and ready. It's much more kind of hitting the ground running and trying to show things in almost real time. And I think that there is a tangibility to my programs that people quite take to, because they can feel that it's real. They can feel that what they're seeing is what actually happened. And, you know, they don't mind quite so much that it's not as perfect, not as glossy, not as beautiful as the Attenborough documentaries might be, because they get a sense of what it was actually like to be there on that expedition, what it was actually like to hold a new species in my hand for the very first time, or to make the very first ascent of a mountain and place the first footfall on its summit that any human being has ever had there. And I think that people have kind of quite engaged with that style of filmmaking. It can be incredibly hard work, but also really rewarding. You know, there is nothing that beats the sensation of swimming into a sunken cave passage, knowing that yours is the first light that has ever illuminated it, that no human being has ever seen it before, and that anything you find there is a new discovery. And that, in this day and age, it feels pretty special.
Please could you tell us about some of the work that you do outside of television?
So I am lucky enough to work for about 15 different wildlife charities. I work for charities that focus on buying back and protecting big areas of tropical rainforest, which I think is the most practical way of genuinely offsetting our own carbon emissions, and also at the same time a cracking way of managing to maintain biodiversity and prevent against deforestation. It's one of the most tangible things that we all can do and get on side of. I consider myself incredibly privileged to have been taken on as a Sky Zero ambassador, which is a role that we're just beginning to understand and just beginning to build. But I can see having an enormous amount of potential. Certainly, Sky have big ideas for how they want to, balance the books in terms of creating a business model that is single-use plastic free, in terms of bringing themselves down to a completely carbon neutral state, which as a media organization is something really dramatic. And I think that in all of the roles that I take outside of television, it's critical to think of conservation starting at home, starting with the things that we ourselves can do, and then building to the bigger picture, because it can feel overwhelming. A lot of the big goals that we have in conservation are so huge that if you start with those, then you can feel very, very small and very insignificant and incapable of making change. Well, you're not. Every individual can make a massive difference. Starting small and realizing that is really important, and something that I would encourage everyone to do. It's one of the reasons that the majority of my charities are right here in the UK. It is, for example, being the president of my local wildlife trust and working with regenerating the environments, and working with other charities that look to redress the balance of negative human activities right here in our own country.
Thanks, Steve. We've got lots of great questions coming in from students, so I'm going to mix them in with the questions we've got for you, just so we don't miss any.
Please do, yes.
So we've got a question coming from Harvey, who asks, what has been your favourite expedition you've done?
It's a really tough call, because every single one of them has had something really special about it. Even the ones that have failed have given me something unique and an insight into, if nothing else, the way that I function, and that I kind of manage to succeed or fail on expeditions. My most treasured was probably the first ascent of a mountain called Uquigma in Venezuela. It was in 2007. It was extraordinarily hard, beyond the limit of my abilities, really. But once we got to the top of these vertical sandstone faces, we were the first human beings ever to set foot on the summit. And normally when you get to the top of a mountain, you don't find very much. There's not really that much living on top of mountains. Here, there was stuff everywhere. And almost by definition, the rodents, the frogs, the bugs that we found were new to science. And feeling like you are an explorer back in the golden era of exploration, and you just simply do not know what you're going to find around every corner, looking around at the most breathtaking views, able to see all the way to Guyana, Brazil, and Venezuela in one single view. That was really special. So I think that I'd probably choose that as my favorite, Harvey. Thanks,
Steve. And please, could you tell us a little bit more about some of your other career highlights?
So I have to say, working on right now with Sky Nature is certainly up there. Anyone who's seen any of my stuff over the last 10 years or so will know that I have something bordering on an obsession for sharks. And to have an opportunity to make a 3-part landmark series like this that deals with this most spectacular but beleaguered group of animals in proper depth and detail is something really special. We've had the opportunity to do some extraordinary trips, heading out into the middle of nowhere in the Pacific to film scalloped hammerhead sharks, heading off into the Indian Ocean to film manta rays and whale sharks. It's already been spectacular, and we are not yet halfway done. So by the time it's finished, I think it's going to be one of the finest programs I've had the honor of working on.
Steve, we would like to know, is your work ever dangerous, and have you experienced any challenges during your career?
Yeah, I mean, the other day, actually, I was sat down with someone, and I was talking about my big maxim about how wildlife, it means us no harm, that you are in no danger from wild animals, and that we shouldn't be frightened of animals, far from it. And then they said, "Oh, wasn't it that time you got bitten by a crocodile?" And I'm like, "Oh, yeah. I mean, there was that, but I mean, I did tread on it accidentally, and I kind of deserved to get bitten." And they said, "And I'm sure I've seen you bitten by a shark." And I went, "Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, there were those couple of times that I was bitten by sharks, but I was hand feeding them, so really, that was my own fault. I can't blame anyone for that." And then I thought, well, and I've probably had nearly a dozen scorpion stings and several hundred stings to the hands by the world's most painful stinging insect, the bullet ant, and got bitten by an adder right here in this country, and got the top of my finger taken off by a piranha. And actually, when you start to add it up, there's been a few over the years. There's been a few sort of like little nips and scratches. Thankfully, nothing too serious. In terms of whether the job is dangerous or not, I think every element of life, including, as everyone will know over this last year, doing nothing, has its risks and has its dangers, whether that's physical or psychological or mental. Everything has a risk of some kind. Whether the job I do is more dangerous or more risky than others, I don't know, but I certainly know that I feel safer in the middle of a rainforest handling the world's most venomous snakes than I do being in a big city at night after closing time, after the pubs close. I feel far more at risk there, far less safe there than I do up a mountain in the middle of the Himalayas.
We're now going to move on to some questions about climate change and your role as a conservationist, and lots of students have asked questions about this as well. So first of all, please could you tell us, what has your work taught you about the action we need to take to tackle climate change?
So one of the problems that we have with climate change is that it is so amorphous, so complex, that the various ways that it can be tackled are so manifold, and it is so pressing as well. And it can be very, very difficult to get a handle on what we individually, personally can do to make a difference. I feel that one of the most profound things we can do is to make sure that the correct messaging is getting out, particularly working in the media. But it can be enormously frustrating. So, as I said, I started off in the late 1990s making programs for National Geographic. I had my first series on climate change in the year 2000, and I can remember working with some of the very finest climate scientists in the world: meteorologists, glaciologists, professors of climate, professors who had brains the size of planets, who were saying to me, "Well, listen, we know what's happening. We know what we have to do about it. The time is now. We have to act now." And 20 years later, we are still saying the same things. And there's so much reticence and so much lack of willing to take on the most simple facts about climate change. And I think that a lot of that is down to the fact that it may seem to be onerous to us as individuals. It may seem that everything we can do to combat climate change can be detrimental to our quality of life. But I don't necessarily see it as being that way. I think also that Sky have really led the way over recent years in terms of how big companies, big corporations can make a big difference, and media organizations too. And that's not true of all of them. Quite a few of the media organizations that I've worked with over the last few years, it's been a struggle even to make sure that we offset the production of our programs, even to make sure that we offset our flights, for example, which obviously is something that we're all desperate to do. But we're still at a stage where we kind of have to be doing the basics, which drives me a little bit insane. But you have to know where you're at. You have to start there and then work your way upwards. And I think the fact that we have all these students who are here asking these questions, engaging with the topic at all, is a really positive thing. Certainly, this kind of discussion couldn't have happened 20 years ago, and certainly not when I was a kid. Let's just hope that it's not too late, and that there are lots of people watching this who are willing to get involved, stand up, and make a difference.
We've had a question come in from Kira, who asks, Over your career, have you seen any positive changes in society that have helped to reduce climate change?
Do you know what? I think that I have seen my most intense period of positive change over this last year. And I know that we all live in bubbles, and we all have a different experience of society and the world at large. But when I started doing my lockdown lessons, my Q&As at the start of lockdown last year, I was getting as many as 400,000 households tuning in each time, and that's quite a decent section of the populace. And what I was hearing over and over again was, what can we do? How can we make change? People were, because their time outside was being meted out to them in set chunks of an hour long, they were treasuring that time more than they ever had done before. And I think gaining an appreciation of nature and all it can do for us that I've never seen in my lifetime. And I think that over the last year, and obviously I can't say it's everyone, but the cross section of people that I am connected to is more engaged with nature now than at any other time in history. I'd follow that up by saying there is absolutely no question in my mind that we are right now at the vanguard of a very, very exciting movement in terms of activism. And that is where young people are, everyone talks about Greta, of course they do. But the fact is that we have 1,000 Gretas right here in this country who are just as eloquent, just as committed, just as ambitious. And I say this quite a lot, but I honestly think that in years to come, we're going to look back at this time now as being alongside many of the great civil rights movements of the past, as a time when young people, specifically young people, have gone, no, this isn't good enough. We're sick and tired of you, older generation, making all of the pollution, creating all the damage and doing absolutely nothing to set it right. And I find that really, really exciting. A whole generation of young people going, no, we're going to stand up and make a difference. And I'm very, very proud, excited, and inspired by what they're all achieving.
Gary says, "Hi Steve, will we have an ozone layer in years to come, and how can we protect our wildlife?"
So the ozone layer is a little bit different to the main argument, the main conversation around anthropogenic climate change. The ozone layer is arguably one of the great positives that we have managed to get on top of in the past, which gives me hope that we may be able to do the same when it comes to global warming. So there was a critical problem with the ozone layer, particularly holes that were developing over the Arctic and the Antarctic. This was particularly in the 80s and the 90s, and it was very strongly linked to chlorofluorocarbons, which were found in aerosols and also in fridges. And when it was discovered, when it became big news that this catastrophe was ongoing and that we were going to suffer tremendously because of it, very, very quickly around the world, those CFCs, as they were called, were banned. And there has been good science to show that there has been significant recovery in our ozone layer. And if we could have done it then, why can we not do it now for anthropogenic climate change? I think that it is a symbol of what can be achieved.
And Steve, you were at the launch of the Environment Bill in 2019. Please could you speak to us about the aims of this bill and the progress that is made so far?
So the aims are probably too big to go into in this conversation. It was a very, very big document. Essentially, what we're looking for, particularly post-Brexit, when there's so much flux in terms of how our nation is run, is to have put down in law, to have put down in what for us as Brits it kind of equivocates to a constitution, the rights of the environment, the rights that we should have to have healthy ecosystems here in this country. And there are manifold things that need to be in place, which need to include, apart from anything else, DEFRA being given a much higher position in terms of its standing in government. How's it gone? Well, there were very big promises made at the announcement of the Environment Bill by Michael Gove, who was then Secretary of State for the Environment. None of them, precisely none of them, have come to fruition, and there is as yet no proper Environment Bill out there and ready to roll. But that said, there is still a lot of very positive talk on all sides of the political spectrum for what can and should be achieved in terms of the environment. A lot of people say that that's greenwashing. A lot of people say that that is, people like our present Prime Minister riding on the possible positive wave of positivity that can come out of talking about the environment and climate change. I don't care. I absolutely don't care what his motivations are. If he decides to put his money where his mouth is when it comes to the environment, then his motivations can be entirely negative. Doesn't bother me at all, as long as the environment is there on the table being discussed alongside all of the other huge costs we have coming out of our national coffers.
We've had a question from Abel, who says, how far can technology help to save the situation?
So there is a school of thought that says that too much concentration on new technology, particularly, like seeding clouds with silver nitrate in order to, reduce rays or any of that kind of stuff, it is potentially a distraction. It is a way that we can have big business and big corporations telling us, don't worry about, about not spending, don't worry about offsetting, don't worry about all these things that you need to do. It's all right. We'll come up with some space age thing which will just be a widget which will solve it all in a heartbeat. And it seems unlikely that any of those things are going to be the quick fix solution that we need. What we need is big targets, and we need to follow through on them. And as much as we can talk today about personal responsibility and the things that we can all do to reset the balance on a personal scale, it has to come from corporations and from governments. And so we need to let our voices be heard. We need to rattle the cage of government particularly, and try and make sure that, all of those big targets are followed through on. And I think one of the things that is starting to give me cause for positivity is that a lot of businesses are standing up on their own, as Sky have done, and saying, well, actually, we're going to set a decent target. We're going to make ourselves, forget about the government saying 2050. We're going to make ourselves carbon neutral by 2030, which is a heartbeat away. We're going to, get rid of all new petrol and diesel cars by 2030. Those kind of targets and the possibility of achieving them, and corporations doing them for either altruistic or economic reasons without having been forced to, it is all a big part of the solution. And you all, as consumers and as voters, have a part to play in that.
And how has your writing and work in television enabled you to advocate for conservation?
Sometimes it's quite tricky, I think there are certain things, like, for example, with shark and with shark conservation, I feel that the media is extraordinarily important, because so much of it is based, so much of the problem, so much of the crisis with sharks is based in misunderstanding and inappropriate fear and loathing, which, to a certain extent we can set that right. We have the opportunity to demystify and de-menace sharks, to let people know the scale of the problem, and therefore to help to redress the balance. That's one of the situations where the media can be really powerful and make a massive, massive difference. Climate change is a hard one, because television and a lot of media to a certain extent relies on simple stories and simple messages, and it's very, very difficult to tell a simple story with climate change. Everything has to be qualified and quantified in a way that telly doesn't often like. And also, you know, in the media, we're in quite a carbon costly business for lots of reasons. And quite often, if I stand up and try and talk about climate change for good reason, I'll end up spending a very good part of the conversation talking about my own personal carbon footprint and what I'm doing to offset it. And I don't think that necessarily helps. I think, you know, that can be very distracting. It can take us away from the main argument. So there are certain times when I think that the media is one of the most powerful tools we have to solve conservation. The mainstream, the kind of, for want of a better word, old-fashioned media, I think, you know, in certain situations can be incredibly powerful. At other times, it can also almost be counterproductive. And that's where I think that particularly young people, and particularly this new young wave of activists who are finding a new way of telling their stories, and who are, you know, so much more now doing it on social media, doing it on YouTube, and you know, finding a way of shouting so that everyone can be heard, but at the same time they're not being accused of hypocrisy, is really, really powerful. And I'd encourage anyone out there, any of the young people who are out there watching this broadcast right now, you know, one of the best ways that you can make a difference, but also one of the best ways that you can set yourself apart for your life to come, is to think about ways that you can find an innovative, different, unique way of, you know, telling these stories. It's become a way that an awful lot of people have found themselves into, you know, really prominent positions, able to make a great difference, is from finding that way of telling the story.
And many students are interested in knowing more about what they can do. So Brady and Mohammed have both asked, what are things that they can do to combat climate change and to make our planet greener?
I think the second one is a much more simple, easy solution. You know, I think that to be able to set about rewilding our own local patch is something that may seem to be quite trivial, but can be immensely powerful. I've spent most of today on a conference talking about beelines, which are a wonderful idea that we're putting in progress to create a map across the country that connects existing wildflower habitats to enable pollinators. Obviously, pollinators like bees are in massive decline, and 97% of our wildflower-rich habitat in this country has disappeared since my parents were kids. So being able to help to connect existing wildflower meadows, be it by using verges or train tracks or brownfield sites, is of enormous, stratospheric importance to managing to maintain biodiversity and to also, you know, treat our green places proper. In terms of what we can do for climate change, you know, there are lots of things that we can do on a personal level. For me, I would say when it comes to personal responsibility, my most important one is in connection with the World Land Trust. So I offset everything that I do personally, from, you know, the miles I might drive in the car to those I fly in airplanes. All of our productions, our television productions, are also offset, and that's everything from, you know, the occasional helicopter flight down to the computers that run in the office and the gas that we use to power our stoves when we're cooking out in the field. And the money that we raise from that goes into purchasing old growth forest in specific strategic locations around the world. And that to me is a really, really powerful tool. You know, it has its role in offsetting carbon emissions. It also provides a repository for biodiversity, which is, you know, incredibly potent. I have another project which I'm hoping to launch with the World Land Trust a little bit later this year for a giant purchase of land in Central America. So watch this space. Please get on board and think about potentially, you know, raising the money that would save an equivalent area of rainforest to the size of your university playing fields or your college grounds or your school playing field. At £100 an acre, it's easily done and can have such pragmatic, tangible, positive effects.
And our students would like to know, what are some of the ways that climate change will affect us if we don't take this action that you've just spoken about?
Climate change is already affecting us. It's super difficult to say. You absolutely cannot go through a period of flooding and go, oh, it's climate change. You can't say, oh, that hurricane, climate change. You can't say, oh, that tornado, that cyclone, climate change. Of course you can't. But the fact that they are increasing so dramatically in their ferocity and their frequency is without question climate change. And we are already experiencing in Arctic summers as much as a 4-degree rise in temperature from when I was a kid, which is insane. I mean, that is a huge amount. Because of that, we're experiencing increased calving of glaciers, increased melt of sea ice, and we're within touching distance of an Arctic summer with no pack ice whatsoever, where the North Pole is just sea. And that, in turn, will lead to the so-called albedo effect, the lack of a reflective mirror, essentially, at the north of our planet, reflecting heat back into space, which will lead to feedback loops and an increase in temperature rise. I'm sure all of you have heard about coral bleaching as a result of rise in sea level temperatures, and the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. There's lots of people who say that is on its way out. Certainly they have huge areas of the Barrier Reef that is suffering from bleaching because of a mere 1 degree rise in sea temperatures. So the effects are hitting us already. They're going to be huge. They're going to be complex. What we need to do is to keep that mean rise in temperature as low as we possibly can. And, I guess pretty much like with the pandemic earlier next year, we need to flatten the curve. We need to have this happening over a slower period of time. If it can happen over 300 years, 400 years, then the ferocity of the events that it creates is going to be so much less dramatic than if it happens over 20 years.
Our students would like to know if having houseplants helps in any way.
Makes you feel better. I mean, you'd have to have an awful lot of houseplants to make a drastic difference to anthropogenic climate change and a very, very big house. But that said, I do honestly believe that having window boxes, for example, if you have no garden, or having houseplants that may have some kind of access to potential pollinators and bugs, can make a difference. Certainly in city areas, it's pretty much all we have. And apart from that, there's very good science to show that surrounding yourself with greenery, even if it is just houseplants, has a positive effect on your sense of well-being. So yes, of course it can help.
Yeah, I love a houseplant. Totally agree. Gary would like to know how we can combat poaching and the killing of wildlife in the world and prevent extinction.
Massive question, Gary. Thank you so much for asking it. So we need governments to throw more weight behind organizations like IUCN and CITES. We need greater patrolling of international borders when it comes to the illegal wildlife trade. And we need to let our presence be felt. We're in a time where relationships between nations are extraordinarily important. Well, if we're willing to put those relationships on the line for trade, for example, then we should be willing to do it for illegal wildlife trade. If we're not prepared to tell our friends on the other side of the world that, for example, trading in 1 million pangolins, which are already, a scarce species purely for their scales, in traditional medicines which do not work, excuse me, if we're not prepared to do that, then those animals will go. They'll be extinct. I've had some really bleak filming trips over recent years with rhino, for example, with elephant. All those animals are under critical threat. And there are some very, very committed people who are giving everything. And when I say everything, I do mean everything to the protection of those animals on the ground. But unless, the big organizations and the governments can get on side, then they're really fighting a losing battle. So this is another one where we as voters and as people with a voice have to let our passions be known. We have to let our government know that these things are important to us. And I used the example earlier on there of pangolins and talked about the fact that is a situation that's driven by trade on the other side of the world. That there are plenty of wildlife trades that are driven by our own demands right here in this country. And we need to get on top of that. We need to make sure that we can cut these trades off at source, cut out the demand. And when I was talking earlier on actually about why I thought that that the media, the mainstream old-fashioned media, can be really potent in cases like, for example, the shark story, I really meant it. I think that making programs about shark conservation, about letting it be known that sharks are wonderful, that we need them, that they're beautiful, that they are being lost because of lipstick and mislabeled fish and fish and chip shops, because of inappropriate uses of squalene, because of shark fin soup. Letting people know that those things are a problem is something that the media does very well. And we all now have access to the media in one form or another, whether it's Instagram, YouTube, TikTok. There are lots and lots of young people out there who can reach more people on TikTok than I will be able to do in a year. So get stuck in, find your passion project and get out there and shout about it.
Thanks, Steve. Abel would like to know, what do you think the future of the planet will be? Do you think it will be hot because of global warming, or do you think we could have another ice age?
Another big question. The short answer is both. We have gone through a series of both hot and cold spells over the last 4.5 billion years, and there will be plenty more to come. The question is the frequency and what happens during the time of human dominance of the planet. We're talking about changes that have happened in within about 50 to 100 years. That's not a geological timescale. That is a human lifespan. Our planet and its atmosphere and its temperature and its climate should not be changing in a human life scale. That shouldn't be happening. It should be happening in tens of thousands of years. So yes, there will absolutely be more ice ages. There will absolutely be more hot spells. The big question is whether that's 10,000 years from now or 50 years from now. My personal sense is, my hope is, that we can start to cap our emissions. We can start to bring down our temperature increase. It's going to carry on increasing. It's going to carry on increasing for the duration of certainly of my lifetime. But if we can keep it within manageable levels, then potentially we can continue to make advances to make sure that we can at least deal with the problems and not have it turn into huge global conflicts, into global famine, and into an increase in equality, essentially, which is what I see far too much now.
We've had some questions come in about your work in television. So a student would like to know if you could tell us about the origin of the deadly 60 and why 60.
I can talk about that for hours. How long you got? So I was working on a series called The Really Wild Show for the BBC. It came to an end and there was a big gaping gap in the schedules. And so I went to the commissioner of Children's BBC and said, I've got this idea where I go out and I get bitten and stung by a whole bunch of things. And I come back and I tell you about them and tell them why they're deadly. And they went, yeah, sounds great. And when was that? It was 2007. 14 years later, I'm still doing it. I'm going to do the next series over this summer, actually, which is going to be super, super cool. I think that I personally have always really believed that programming for a young and family audience is so disproportionately important. You're speaking to an audience that haven't yet made up their mind how they feel about the world, and have the opportunity to discover new passions, new enthusiasms, which could drive their entire life. And I'm really lucky that now I'm getting to the stage of my career where I'm regularly hearing people writing and going, I'm studying marine biology at Bangor University because I watched Deadly 60 when I was a kid and thought it'd be really cool. And I'm like, what? That's the most awesome thing I've ever heard in my entire life. The thought that those programs can have had any impact on even just a handful of people is really special, and I'm so glad and so proud that we got it started and that it's still going.
And Steve, your show is called The Deadly 60. A student has asked, Steve, how do you manage to stay alive?
Well, it's a good question. So my maxim with The Deadly 60 has always been that it's about animals that are deadly in their own world to each other and not to us. And overwhelmingly, that has proven to be the case over the more than 20 years that I've been making wildlife television programs. I could, in that time, recount no more than 4 or 5 occasions where I've honestly felt that my life has been in danger because of an animal. And I've spent almost all of that 20 years deliberately catching the world's most venomous snakes and spiders and scorpions. So, if I feel that as someone who has been at the cutting edge for that entire time, honestly, it is definitely true. Wild animals do not mean us any harm. And to me, the ultimate deadly animal would be a dragonfly or a kestrel or an orca, something that it clearly is of no danger to us as human beings, but in their world, in the way that they interact with their prey, is beyond perfect.
And Steve, you spoke about how you have inspired students to go on to do their studies. A student would like to know, do you have any advice on work experience if you're looking to go into environmental science?
Yeah. Incidentally, I didn't say that loads of people have been inspired by me. That makes me sound unbelievably arrogant and smug. Not that I'm not arrogant and smug, but yes, I have actually. So what I can say is that actually getting jobs in conservation and environment is quite hard. And one of the reasons for that is that an awful lot of NGOs get a good amount of their funding through people, paying to go away and work with turtles, work with dolphins, work with sharks, because it's an awesome thing to do. So you do need to build up a strong CV to stand any chance of making a living, of properly turning this into a career. And I think that the best way of doing that is to start on your local patch. So start with, for example, your local wildlife trust, your local woodland trust. Start with your local wildlife refuge, and start volunteering as soon as you possibly can. Give as much of your time and your effort and your energy to properly giving back to the environment on your own turf. And my first job when I was like 12 years old was working for the RSPCA, and I got more out of that. It was more of a learning experience than I think my biology degree was, in a tangible, hands-on sort of way. So yeah, I think get started as soon as you possibly can, volunteer, and yeah, go local, because I think that's the way that we have to always begin.
And have there been any other conservationists that have inspired you in your role?
Do you know what? Right now, I think I'm inspired every single day by someone new. I'm very lucky that I get the opportunity to work with a lot of young conservationists. There's a couple of girls, the kids Be Plastic, who I work in quite close sort of proximity with, Amy and Ella, who are they just completely blow my mind. How anyone of their age can be so driven, so ambitious, so eloquent, and have such big goals. It's just awesome. I had Bella Lack come and speak at one of my events last year, and she was surrounded by dames and sirs and lords, and she stole the show. The entire place was standing ovation. The young conservationists who are out there making a difference and are just so eloquent. I mean, it can be really intimidating, but at the same time, it gives me so much hope, and it is totally inspiring.
A student has asked, which part of what you do for a living do you love the most?
I love exploration. I love being on expeditions where you are, where you're the first, where you honestly don't know what you're going to see next, what's going to happen next. The possibility that you could see an animal that could be iconic, that has clearly never seen human beings before and is not yet frightened of them, and might be super easy to approach, might even want to interact with you, be intrigued with you as a human being. Or have the opportunity to discover completely new species, ones that have not yet been catalogued by science. Those moments stay with you. They stay with you for a long, long time. And I think that all of the most powerful moments in my career would fit into those categories.
We've got time for a couple more questions. You've spoken about the importance of a state of nature. Can you tell the students what you mean by this?
So you're talking about the state of nature paper and address that we did. When was that? Was that 2018, 2019? So this was essentially, I think, one of the strong things about state of nature is that it was very collaborative. So essentially, every single British wildlife conservation outdoors organization all came together and created a paper that sought to quantify where we're at right now, that sought to kind of figure out, how are we doing when it comes to nature? How much have we lost? And what can we do to set that right? And all those organizations working together, each one of them, if you look at plant life or bug life or bat conservation, those are not massive charities. But when they come together, and when you bring together all of their membership, you could be talking about tens of millions of people. And those tens of millions of people are all passionate about something. They all have an enthusiasm, whether that's moths or bats or birds, or whether it's cycling or kayaking. All those people are passionate about our natural environments for a reason. The findings of the State of Nature address were pretty damning and pretty depressing as well. But the fact that all of these organizations were prepared to come together, to work together, to share their data and share their positive plan for the future was massive. It was absolutely massive. And it was a big part driving what came to be the Environment Bill. And I think that what it shows is that we all need to work together. I quite often get a bit depressed in the conservation movement that a lot of people seem to spend most of their time and their effort and energy in criticizing other conservationists, in looking at other environmentalists and trying to find ways that they're hypocrites, trying to find ways to undo them. And that's all wrong. We have such big problems to try and fix that we have to do it together. We have to recognize the people who are on our side, take them firmly by the hand and move together towards a positive future.